The letter arrived on a Tuesday morning, folded inside a stiff white envelope stamped with the association seal, the kind designed to look official enough that most homeowners assume compliance before even reading the first line. And
Another warning letter from the HOA.
Notice
This is
because over the years
ridiculous.
they had sent
They
reminders
want me to
about
tear
trash
down my
bins,
workshop.
seasonal decorations, and lawn height. But the tone of this letter was different, colder, deliberate, written in language that suggested not a request, but an accusation stating that my property was in violation of community structural conformity standards due to the small backyard workshop I had completed 2 months earlier, and that failure to remove or dismantle the structure within 10 days would result in escalating daily penalties starting at $300 per day with potential lien proceedings if the matter remained unresolved. At first glance, the accusation made no sense because the workshop hadn't been built secretly or overnight. It had gone through the exact process the HOA itself required: architectural request form, material specification sheet, design drawing submission, and final written approval from the Architectural Review Committee, a process that had taken nearly 6 weeks and involved 3 separate email confirmations before construction even began, and when the project was finished I had even sent photos of the completed structure to the same committee member who originally approved it, who replied with a short message saying the result looked consistent with neighborhood standards. So when the violation letter claimed the structure had never been approved, it immediately raised a question that bothered me more than the threat of fines. Either someone had made a careless administrative error, or someone on the board had decided to pretend the approval never existed. Instead of responding emotionally, I did the simplest thing possible. I checked my records. Every email, every form, every digital file saved from the approval process. The documentation trail was clear and complete. Submission date, approval confirmation, and even the committee member's digital signature attached to the authorization notice. Which meant the letter wasn't just wrong. It was impossible. The next afternoon I walked into the HOA management office with a printed folder containing the approval email and the signed review form, expecting the situation to be resolved within 5 minutes once someone looked at the paperwork, but the conversation didn't unfold the way reasonable conversations usually do, because instead of reviewing the documents the property manager glanced at the folder and calmly told me that the board had recently re-evaluated certain architectural allowances, and that the workshop on my property no longer met the association's revised interpretation of acceptable structures. That phrase, revised interpretation, was the moment the situation shifted from confusion to suspicion. Because interpretations don't override written approvals. And rules don't change retroactively. When I asked when the rules had supposedly changed, the manager said the board had internally updated their position during the last policy review meeting, but when I asked for the official amendment documentation or the meeting minutes confirming the vote, the answer suddenly became vague, and vague answers from organizations that rely on written governance usually mean one thing: the documentation either doesn't exist or doesn't say what they wish it said. So instead of arguing further, I requested the minutes from the last 3 board meetings, specifically the session where the alleged structural reinterpretation had been adopted, because if the board had legitimately changed the rule then the vote would be recorded. And if the vote wasn't recorded then the rule technically hadn't changed at all. 3 days later the documents arrived. And what they revealed was more interesting than I expected. The meeting notes contained a short discussion about maintaining neighborhood aesthetic harmony, and a comment from one board member suggesting that backyard workshops might create visual inconsistency, but there was no motion proposing a rule amendment, no seconded vote approving a new restriction, and no reference to any structural prohibition replacing the previous guidelines. In other words, the rule the board was now trying to enforce had never actually been adopted. It had only been mentioned in conversation. And conversations don't override approvals. That discovery changed everything because it meant the warning letter wasn't just incorrect. It was enforcement based on something that had no legal standing inside the association's own governance framework. But before confronting the board again, I decided to verify something else first. Because if they were willing to ignore one approval, there was a good chance they had done the same thing to someone else. And when I started quietly asking a few neighbors whether they had received unusual notices recently, 2 of them mentioned letters about fence height and driveway modifications that sounded suspiciously similar to mine, which meant the situation might not be a single mistake. Might be a pattern. And if it was a pattern, then the warning letter sitting on my kitchen table wasn't just a threat. It was evidence. Evidence that the HOA board had just made a decision they probably thought no homeowner would ever challenge. But the moment I realized how fragile their position actually was, I stopped thinking about defending my workshop, and started thinking about something else entirely. Because the problem with sending a warning letter is that once you send it, you create a record. And records can be used in ways the sender never intended. Which is exactly when the situation stopped being about a small backyard structure and started becoming the HOA board's worst nightmare. The letter arrived on a Thursday morning, tucked inside a plain white envelope with the HOA logo printed in dark green. At first glance, I assumed it was another routine note about lawn maintenance, but the subject line, immediate action required, landscape nonconformity, hinted at something more severe. The letter claimed that my front yard, specifically a small cluster of native shrubs I had planted 2 months prior, violated community aesthetic standards, and demanded their removal within 7 days, threatening fines of $250 per day thereafter. I paused. The shrubs hadn't been planted in secret. They were the very same species recommended on the HOA's own approved plantings list. And weeks earlier, I had submitted a landscaping request form that received an email confirmation from the Architectural Committee. Your planting plan aligns with neighborhood standards. Approval granted. So why this letter? Instead of panicking, I dug out my records, emails, forms, photographs, everything. The documentation clearly showed my approval date, the committee's confirmation, and even a time-stamped screenshot of their official acknowledgement. Nothing about this could be a mistake, unless someone had chosen to ignore the paper trail. When I went to the HOA office the next day, the receptionist barely glanced at my folder before explaining that the board had recently tightened landscaping regulations. When I asked to see the official rule change, she became evasive, claiming the documents were in transition. I requested the past 3 board meeting minutes. Days later, they arrived, and what I found was striking. There was discussion about improving curb appeal, and a passing remark about native shrubs looking inconsistent. But no motion, no vote, no rule amendment had been formally adopted. The rule the board was trying to enforce didn't legally exist. Then, quietly asking neighbors, I discovered that another homeowner had received a similar letter about solar garden lights. Patterns emerged. One by one, small violations seemed to appear across the neighborhood, all based on conversations, not rules. By this point, the letter on my counter wasn't just a threat. It was a record of the HOA trying to enforce a rule they had never actually passed. And as I leaned back, I realized that the HOA's little power play had inadvertently created a weapon, one I could use if the board decided to escalate. It started on a Monday when I found a crisp HOA notice in my mailbox claiming my driveway was non-compliant with approved materials standards. According to the letter, my recent concrete resurfacing project violated rules, and if not corrected within 10 days, I faced fines of $400 per day. Confused, I reviewed my paperwork. I had submitted a resurfacing plan months earlier. The HOA Architectural Committee had signed off on it via email, confirming that the materials and finish were consistent with neighborhood standards. Instead of reacting impulsively, I requested all relevant documentation from the HOA. Emails confirmed the approval, and even the digital signatures matched the committee's records. When I brought this folder to the HOA office, the property manager calmly explained that board interpretations had changed regarding concrete finishes. I asked for the documentation proving this rule change. A vote, an amendment, anything official. She offered vague references to policy updates, but no concrete proof. Determined, I requested the minutes from the last 3 board meetings. A week later, the documents arrived. After reviewing them, the pattern was clear. There had been discussions about modernizing curb aesthetics, and a fleeting comment about driveway finishes, but no vote had been taken, no amendment formally passed. Once again, the HOA was attempting to enforce a rule that did not exist. Then I spoke with 2 neighbors, both of whom had received similar letters regarding deck materials and patio fences. A disturbing pattern emerged. These enforcement letters were circulating across the community, all based on informal discussions rather than official action. By this stage, the letter on my counter was no longer just a threat. It was evidence. And as I realized the breadth of the HOA's overreach, it dawned on me that the warning they had sent might just be the beginning of a bigger reckoning.